Our webinar. We're excited that you've joined us. Our topic for the webinar is taking open source security to the next level. And today's webinar is sponsored by WhiteSource. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'm happy to be your host and moderator for today's webinar. A few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, and we will be sending out the recording and slides to all participants. You'll receive an email with a link to download those, as well as get them on securityboulevard.com. Our speakers today love questions, so we would really appreciate any questions that you have. You can enter them anytime during the webinar while they're speaking, as well as during the Q&A period into the questions tab of GoToWebinar, and we'll be happy to get to those. So now let's move to our topic, taking open source security to the next level. It's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First is Amy DeMartine, who's Vice President, Research Director serving security and risk professionals from Forrester. And our second speaker is Jeff Crum, Senior Director of Product Marketing with WhiteSource. With that, let's take it away. Amy, it's all yours.
Thanks, Mitch. If we could go to the next slide. So as part of Forrester, we have these huge surveys that we do. We call them technographics. And we have one specifically for security. Every year we ask, have you experienced a breach? And then the next question we ask is, was it from an internal attack or an external attack? And 33% of the firms said that they suffered a breach because of an external attack. And then we go that one click down and we say, okay, how was it carried out? Now, multiple responses are accepted. So it could be that an attack had multiple different methods of getting in, but sad to say that applications has come up as the #1 attack method for many years now. And the two at the top, vulnerabilities and web application weaknesses, have been duking it out for which is the worst. This year's data came out that software vulnerabilities is the worst, with 40% saying of the firms responding saying that that's how an attacker got in, and 37% saying that they got in with SQL injection or cross-site scripting, some kind of web application weakness. The interesting thing about this data is not only that, of course, vulnerabilities is #1 yet again, but also the fact that if I were to show you the comparison of the data over previous years, you would have seen applications actually widening their difference between all the other options on this list. So it's interesting that, now software vulnerabilities, 40% of the firms say that it's actually with vulnerabilities, which is crazy that it's just getting worse and worse and worse. So we are not actually getting better, we're actually getting worse overall. Next slide. So at the same time that applications are getting worse and worse and worse, we also have our developers increasing their speeds. So what they're doing is they are breaking down their monolithic applications into smaller and smaller pieces. That's the agile methodology. And then they're automating the entire software delivery lifecycle. Sometimes you'll hear it called the CI/CD pipeline. And what they're doing is from when they check in the code all the way out into production, possibly they've automated that entire stream. And so when you look at release speeds, you'll see about a third of, and this comes from our developer survey, a third of the organizations are still releasing half yearly or slower. And that really, if you look back 5 years, that was about as fast as you could go without any of that automation. About a third of the organizations release once per quarter, which is actually speeding up a lot from the half yearly or longer, but they probably haven't implemented DevOps. They've probably gone so far as to do Agile, breaking the application into smaller and smaller pieces, but they probably don't have that underlying automation. And then we have the last group where 27% say they release monthly or faster, and 35% say they build multiple times per day or on check-in. Those organizations have really invested in major automation throughout that software delivery lifecycle and are probably pretty far along on their DevOps practice. Now, it could be that your firm has all three of these different types of applications. In fact, it's probably likely that they do. that it's not just that you have all applications releasing super fast or that you have them releasing really slow. You probably have a few key, very critical applications that are releasing very quickly. Some apps that are more recent, maybe not truly legacy, but that are releasing in that once per quarter. And then you've got your legacy applications. They might be in maintenance mode, or they might just be applications that are really hard to change. Those then fall in the last bucket. The thing to know about this is you are going to have to accommodate where your developers are, no matter where they are on this stream. If they're moving super fast or they're moving slow, you're going to have to accommodate with your testing. You're also going to have to accommodate all of the different languages that may be happening here. So you may be having lots of newer languages show up, like Ruby or Go in the faster moving applications. And you might even have Fortran and COBOL on some of the slower moving. So you've got to meet your developers wherever they are. What I usually tell clients is aim for the faster ones. You're going to have to cover language coverage, but if you're able to pick tools that can match the speeds of your fastest releasing apps, then that's where you should go. Next slide. So software composition analysis is actually cooler than you may realize. What it does is it's looking for any kind of third-party component, open source component that has a known vulnerability. And then it's going to identify the known vulnerability, and it's going to say, okay, these are your mitigation options. You can go to a later version that doesn't have that vulnerability. There might be a workaround or a patch to the system that you can apply. And the great thing about software composition analysis is you can push it really early in the software delivery lifecycle. So if you think about those development teams that have done major work on DevOps and major work on automating the software delivery lifecycle or the CI/CD pipeline, you can make use of that and pop in your software composition analysis as early as possible in the software delivery lifecycle. Now, what's interesting about software composition analysis is that you can actually put it, some of the vendors actually have things like Crum extensions, so that as a developer is out in the wilds of the internet looking for their open source component that is just the right fit, it will actually tell them proactively whether or not it complies with company policy. So if you've said, I don't want any critical or serious issues in any of my open source components, it will actually say whether or not it complies, that open source component that they're looking at complies with company policy. That's as early as you're going to get in the software delivery lifecycle. It doesn't get any earlier than as a developer is going off into the wild to try to pick their component. You can actually then put quality gates throughout the software delivery lifecycle. So you'll see my little Gandalf here, thou shall not pass. You can actually put those quality gates at various points in the lifecycle. Now, in addition to the Chrome extension saying, hey, whether I comply or I don't comply, you're definitely going to still want to insert a quality gate somewhere in the software delivery lifecycle, hopefully early, maybe at check-in, for example, to make sure that even if the developer looked and thought it didn't comply to policy, but it really did what they wanted, they were in love with that component, they pop it in, you do want to make sure that there is a hard quality gate somewhere in the software delivery lifecycle that will stop the developer and say, no, you really can't use that component. It doesn't comply with company policy. So even if you use that early super check, make sure that you also include a hard quality gate. Next slide. So I've just said that software composition analysis is cooler than you may think because you can put it super early in the software delivery lifecycle, which is so amazingly great. Unfortunately, the depressing news is that companies aren't doing that. So if you are implementing software composition analysis, I would encourage you to move it as early as possible. Today, what we see, so the light blue line is what companies have already implemented or are implementing. The dark blue line is what they're planning to implement in the next 12 months. And you see that there's a huge spike actually in the testing phase. Well, by the time it's gotten to the testing phase, developers get super annoyed if you're going to stop them there. They've got to go back and figure out what that component was, what it did. Is it okay to upgrade? And so it's almost too late. And definitely by the time it's in production, you see that, it's way too late. It's already out into the wild. It's already with customers and attackers at the same time. So I would love to see in the latest data a migration earlier and earlier, even in the design part, where the developers are often allowed looking for the right component, but certainly in development, where on check-in, for example, you've got a hard quality gate, and that's where people are implementing software composition analysis. Next slide. Okay, so I've talked about the fact that applications are getting worse, not better. Talked about the fact that at the same time the developers are moving to ever faster releases. And then you've got this automated testing that you can insert into the software delivery lifecycle. So this creates the perfect storm. You've got early testing and automation. Suddenly you've overloaded your developers with way too many issues. And I talk to organizations all the time. Either they've just turned this on, or they have done it for a while, but developers pretty much ignore it. There's not a hard quality gate. Maybe there's a soft quality gate. There's just too many results for developers to fix. Developers look at the results and think, I don't even know where to start with this. We're going to have to do several releases, sprints, where it's just security if we're going to fix all of these. And it's at that point where I talk to them about how do you really prioritize what you're fixing. Next slide. And I'm going to throw in one more problem into this mix, and that is developers aren't trained about security, about how to write secure code. It's just not part of their education. So as part of a paper that we recently did, we rifled through the top 40 best U.S. computer science programs. We used U.S. News World Report, and we rifled through them all of their classes, and looked to see if they mentioned anything about secure coding practices. Next slide. None of the top 40 computer science programs in the U.S. required a class about secure coding or secure application design. None of them. So if you're a security pro and you're super frustrated with your devs and you're thinking, come on, developers, get with the program, especially if they use super old open source components, of course, they're more likely to have vulnerabilities, and they're not going to get fixed. If a new vulnerability gets disclosed, the open source community is going to fix the latest one. And if they picked a super old version, migrating is going to be tough. So it's almost like they create their own problems for themselves. But this is why they have no idea that what they're including is vulnerable, is a problem. They really are not trained to understand this. Next slide. So you may be thinking, okay, so if the U.S. universities don't train my developers, maybe what I should do is encourage my firm to actually go international. Unfortunately, they weren't much better. We looked at the top 5 international schools to say, okay, who's doing this well, and didn't find anything good here either. Now, the only thing good here was the University of Cambridge actually did require students to take a software and security engineering course that included elements of secure code design, but it was really mostly focused on network security. So they had our hopes up, and then we got our hopes dashed. But at least it's got hints, but there's no class on secure coding. So all the developers that you have in your organizations, the ones that you are hiring, I don't see this changing very fast. And so we are really stuck with the fact that our developers don't know anything about security. Application security is getting worse, and yet we're flooding them with all of these results. Next slide. I can't leave you hanging without a golden ticket answer. And the answer is, once again, software composition analysis is cooler than you may think, because you're going to need prioritization. and they're going to need AutoRemediation and to fix the flood of vulnerabilities that they're getting because they don't know about security. They're trying to move faster, and software composition analysis tools offer the solution. Next slide. The first thing with prioritization that you need is, even if you're not using software composition analysis to do the prioritization, you're going to need to limit what your developers need to act on because they just feel overwhelmed with all of the results. Now, most organizations will do it in this order. I want the highest severity in terms of security. If you can tell me if it's been exploited in the wild, that would bump up the priority as well. Because it could be that you just limit to critical and there's still too many results. Okay, so if it's critical and there's been proof of exploit, then I'll fix it. Another way to prioritize is with age. If it's critical, proof of exploit, and it's 13 years old, that I'm going to need to fix. Sometimes you can get into most used. So if this is something that the organization uses a lot, so that if an attacker were to come in, it would be easy for them to replicate that attack across the board, then that might bump up the prioritization. Or it could be the estimated time to fix. If you don't have an AutoRemediation available to you, if it's low-hanging fruit and it's critical, fix it. Just get it off your plate. And then another way I've seen organizations prioritize is the most number of different versions. So for example, I was talking to a client that had almost 50 different versions of Tomcat. That is a lot to manage. If you've got a newly disclosed vulnerability somewhere in that 50 different versions, it can be very difficult then to pinpoint which applications and get them fixed in a timely way. So it could be that you're also trying to reduce the number of different versions that you've got out there. Next slide. AutoRemediation is somewhat new inside of software composition analysis. And it's the ability for developers to easily create patches for themselves. And I like to call it the easy button. I press the button and it's automatically going to create a pull request with an updated manifest file. So if I'm using version 1.2 and 1.7 is vulnerability free, it will just update the manifest file from a 1.2 to a 1.7. It also should be smart enough to include remediation for transient dependencies. So you could be including a component that includes another component that includes another component. It can be very messy when it comes to vulnerabilities. Your vulnerability may be nested several components deep. And so the AutoRemediation should be smart enough to be able to fix all those transient dependencies as well and move you to an appropriate version that is vulnerability free. Next slide. When you're looking at software composition analysis, these are the 5 things that I really think you need to consider. The first one, of course, is language coverage. And we talked about the fact that we've got developers moving slowly, kind of somewhere in the middle, and super fast. And they're probably using a variety of different languages. That is still the top requirement for looking at all the different software composition analysis tools. If they don't cover the languages that your developers are using in all those different instances, then it doesn't meet the requirement. The second thing is, at this point, clients that I talk to demand both license and vulnerability identification. So they're not just looking at vulnerabilities. They also want to know whether or not the license that I have is risky for my business. And that, of course, depends on your firm's risk tolerance. The third thing is, can I integrate it easily into my CI/CD pipeline? Can I use the automation that my developers have created and just pop in software composition analysis as part of that flow so I can do a hard quality gate? And then the last 2 things are exactly what I've been talking about. How do you reduce the flood to your developers who really don't know much about security at all? The first one is prioritization. Can it automatically prioritize for my developers so that they only see the things that they have to be fixing in that moment? And then the last thing is, can it do the easy button? Can I auto-remediate? And I've seen organizations take auto-remediation to an extreme. and start battling each other. So I am on one app dev team and I can remediate faster than yours. And it's fantastic and glorious to see when you see developers who are embracing this and who want to remediate quickly and then use it as bragging rights. Next slide. So where do I think SCA is going? So I don't think open source is going away anytime soon. It already causes security issues. We're living with it. We're living with the breaches that it causes. We're trying to get better about eliminating them in our software products. We're also trying to get better at catching them with the AutoRemediation, the prioritization. I think we're going to get better at this. And I do think that, applications, instead of getting worse, we will turn the tide and it will come back around so that applications aren't as bad as they are today. But I also think that software composition analysis in the future is not only going to have to look at open source component, but services. I think that's what developers will be looking at next. How do I include different services as part of my app? And you're going to need to qualify those as well in both licenses and vulnerabilities. But then eventually, software composition analysis could become a source of truth for developers, where they go to it and they say, okay, tell me what component would be good if I'm looking for this different kind of functionality. And maybe it doesn't just include security. Maybe it says how many people are contributing, how many people are creating, how often do they update it? What's their history with security defects? Do they fix them very quickly? What about bugs in general? Do they fix those very quickly? So it could become a single source of truth for developers. Next slide. So my key takeaways. The first thing that I'd like you to know is that vulnerabilities are still the bane of our existence. They're still the reason for breaches, and it's getting worse. The second thing is that developers are not trained. They do not know that this is a problem, nor do they know really how to fix it. And it seems like updating a manifest file would be an easy thing to do, but they really have no idea. We really have to help guide them through this. And then the third thing is use software composition analysis to your advantage. With the new prioritization, with new AutoRemediation features, these tools can really help your developers sing and really help them move forward with removing the vulnerabilities before they get released out into the wild to attackers and customers at the same time. And with that, I will hand it off to Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Amy. And thanks again to everyone for joining our webinar here. My name again is Jeff Crum, Senior Director of Product Marketing here at WhiteSource. Great talk there by Amy. And what I really want to do here is kind of continue that conversation and talk about some of the areas that Amy highlighted and how that relates to what we're doing here at WhiteSource. Okay, so first I'm just going to talk a little bit about our company, give you a quick intro there, and talk about how we basically attained that leadership position in software composition analysis in the most recent Forrester Wave report. And as part of that, we hit on a number of these areas that Amy highlighted. They're important: prioritization and remediation, as well as coverage. So I'm going to get into details on all of those things. Then I'm going to move on from that and talk about developers tools versus governance tools. These are a couple of major components of software composition analysis tools that are out there today. So I'll talk about the differences between those and how they each relate and what audiences those each target. And then I'll go from there and talk in a little bit more specifically about our solution here at WhiteSource and how it basically contains the sort of components that I'll talk about previous to that. So let's go ahead and get into this. If you think about WhiteSource here, as you can see, we're the leader in the most recent Forrester Wave report, as I'm showing here. And there's a reason for that. A lot of it has to do with some of these capabilities that Amy talked about. A lot of that also has to do with our marketing and position in the market in general. So founded in 2011, we have offices in New York, Boston, London, and Tel Aviv. We have over 800 customers, empowering over 1.2 million developers and supporting 23% of the Fortune 100 companies. Essentially, we have all of those things and we're growing very, very rapidly as well. If you take a look at some of our key customers here, you can see a lot of names that you would recognize. Microsoft, SAP, GE, the list goes on here. And the other thing I would add here is that we're actually seeing more demand in the last 12 months, particularly among the enterprise. But the bottom line really is that every company out there that has a software development team needs a solution like the one we provide and like what Amy was talking about earlier. It doesn't matter what vertical you're in, it doesn't matter what size company you are. If you're doing software development, if you have a team that's engaging in that, you need this type of solution. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So digging then a little bit more into the Wave report, into some of the areas that Amy talked about. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about prioritization, which Amy gave an intro to. She talked about some common areas with which developers can prioritize the vulnerabilities that they're looking at and which ones to address. We've had some advanced technology in that area too that I'm going to talk about as well that would add on to those types of techniques that Amy introduced earlier. Then we'll talk about remediation, that easy button that Amy introduced, where you're able to automatically correct those vulnerabilities that have those fixes available out there and do that as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And then I'll go into a little bit about our coverage and why we're recognized as the industry leader in the amount of environments and languages and everything else that we cover. So I'll get into all of those things here and then we'll go from there. First thing I would like to talk about here is prioritization and really why there's a need for it. If you know, this of course became evident in some of the talk that Amy talked about earlier, but you can see here graphically, there's been a significant rise in the number of open source vulnerabilities that have been reported out there. In fact, the number of disclosed open source vulnerabilities rose 51% in 2018 alone, reaching that 5,100 number that you see here. Now, we believe that this can actually be attributed to the software community's focus, a greater focus on open source security following the widespread adoption of open source components that's been happening over the years and the heightened awareness to security vulnerabilities due to more and more publicized data breaches that we're seeing. So this, if you look at this chart, it's not intended to imply that, hey, you know, open source is getting riskier and more dangerous as time goes on. It's actually the opposite. What we believe is happening here is in the earlier days, people that were using open source components weren't paying as close attention to security as they are now. And then a number of high profile events happened, causing a greater focus on that and a greater reveal into the type of vulnerabilities that were actually already implicitly there. So the good news is that you've got a greater number of open source vulnerabilities being reported along with the fixes that go with them so that those can be addressed. The less good news is that this sheer number of vulnerabilities that are out there that's present now is becoming a huge challenge to developers and to organizations in general that are developing software. In fact, if you look at this, developers are investing way too much time on vulnerabilities as compared to really what organizations would rather have them be doing, which is innovating and developing software to move the business forward and the organization forward. So much so that developers are spending about 15 hours a month, each month, dealing with open source vulnerabilities. This includes reviewing them, discussing them, talking about them, addressing them, remediating them, all of that. And the cost is even higher when you think about the fact that the most experienced developers in the organization are usually the ones tasked with doing this remediation. And it's underscored by the fact that only about 3.8 hours of that time is spent actually on that remediation component. So you've got 15 hours a month being spent by developers, but only 3.8 hours of those being spent actually fixing them. The rest of it's doing all kinds of other tertiary activities around that. So this is why prioritization then becomes a key. And the various techniques with respect to severity and age and frequency and those kinds of things that Amy brought up are of course important in figuring out what you might need to address first. At WhiteSource, we have another level that we've gone beyond that to really help you and to help developers out there address which ones they really need to address first. And we have the concept here of an effective vulnerability versus an ineffective vulnerability. And the way that I would think about that, and I'll describe this in more detail in a minute, is that just because there is a vulnerability that exists in an open source component that you might be using, doesn't mean that your project is necessarily susceptible to that vulnerability. You might not even be calling to that portion of the open source component where that vulnerability exists. You might be completely avoiding that, but how do you know that if all you see is an alert saying this component says there's a severe vulnerability here? Well, this is where our technology comes in, and the way that this works, I'll talk about it through a metaphor here. Think about this building here. Think of this building as being an open source component, okay? And you've got multiple entrances into that building. You've got multiple ways to access the open source component is the way to think about that. So, and then imagine that there's a vulnerability represented in this building as this vulnerable section on the 3rd floor, okay? If you access this building, if you access the open source software component from this left entrance, from that access point, then you have what we have been calling an effective vulnerability. You're potentially susceptible to that vulnerability because through the stairways that you can see there, or through, if you look at the pseudocode, if you've got proprietary code that's calling into that access point in the open source component, you can potentially reach that vulnerable floor, that vulnerable part of the code, and be hit with that vulnerability. On the other hand, if you're accessing the open source component, if you're entering the building from this right entrance, you really don't have any way of reaching that vulnerable part of the building or that vulnerable part of the open source component. So in this case, because you can't even access the vulnerability, we are calling that an ineffective vulnerability, okay? And so if you have that entrance, if you access that component through a place where you can access the vulnerability, then you're at risk. If you're not, then you're not necessarily at risk. So this is the way we actually have this built into our product, where you can see, hey, here's your open source components. Here's the ones that have vulnerabilities, but by the way, this one doesn't have any vulnerabilities that are effective, or this one has ones that are only represented by ineffective vulnerabilities. So that when you're a developer, when you're in the security organization, you're looking at which things that you need to address first, you can address those ones that actually potentially have an impact, rather than having to just look at everything across the board. And we've seen results with some studies that we've done that this can reduce the number of vulnerabilities that you have to address by 70% or more. So it can make a huge impact on that long list of vulnerabilities that you have initially after a scan, and seeing which ones you actually have to look at and deal with before you can move forward. So that's the prioritization component that I wanted to talk about, following up on Amy's initial conversation earlier about the importance of that. The second aspect of really our strength in the Forrester Wave report and what we do here at WhiteSource that we consider to be a unique solution is remediation. And this is really that area of how you go about fixing vulnerabilities once you discover them. I mean, in the world of open source, when a vulnerability is typically reported, about 98% of the time, that's coming with at least one fix offered by the community. So you want to be able to figure out a way to use that as soon as possible. One of the things we do here is we provide links to all the suggested patches, new source files, versions, etc. The other thing that we allow you to do is initiate that remediation workflow automatically. This way you can set up a way to actually, once a vulnerability is detected, you can figure out a way to replace that by setting up rules to make that happen automatically. If you look at the workflow here, automated workflows are initiated when a known vulnerability is detected. This then generates a fixed pull request to speed up the remediation process. And then the pull requests themselves are generated automatically in real time, so the developers really only need to just click merge to update the vulnerability, the vulnerable library. Just clicking merge you can think of as that easy button that Amy talked about earlier. So really the way this works is that once an open source vulnerability has been reported, you're really kind of in a race against hackers on whether they'll fix it before, whether you can fix it before they exploit it. And then with WhiteSource's remediation capability, you can set up a new workflow rule to generate a fixed pull request for all newly detected high severity security vulnerabilities. So that's that second aspect. We talked about prioritization to reduce the number of vulnerabilities that you have. We talked about remediation to more easily fix the ones that come up. And now the third important area we want to talk about here is coverage, which is really, this is what we are recognized for in terms of our level of support across the board. So supporting all languages, we have support for over 200 programming languages out there. Pretty much anything that you could possibly use, we have support for. We can detect all reported vulnerabilities. So the WhiteSource database that we have is the biggest and most mature database of open source vulnerabilities that's out there. It contains hundreds of thousands of vulnerable components, which are aggregated from not only the CVE and NVD databases, but various other sources like the GitHub issue tracker, security advisories, and other types of open source project issue trackers. So we also use a proprietary patented algorithm that matches between the vulnerability and only the impacted version. This way we help eliminate false positives that waste developers' time. So one of the things we try to do here is really balance the fact that we want to be able to discover all of the possible vulnerabilities that are out there that could impact you, but also reducing the number of false positives so that we don't impact developers any more than need to be. We also cover all relevant environments. So coverage for top repositories, including GitHub, Bitbucket. We have GitLab server support coming soon as well. They'll be announcing very shortly. We have IDE integration with IntelliJ and coming soon Eclipse. So we'll have a couple of the top integrated developer environments supported as well. And we have browser integration via Chrome extension. So all those different points we integrate with as well. We can also cater to all groups in your organization, including developers, managers, security and DevOps professionals. And I'll talk a little bit more detail next about how we go about doing that. So those are the three areas that I wanted to cover. Next, I'm going to talk about developer tools versus governance tools, the differences and similarities between those, and then link that to the WhiteSource product line itself. So when you think about developers tools versus governance tools, both teams need security tools, right? So most software composition analysis tools will fall into one or the other of these two categories. Governance tools or governance solutions will do things like enforcing policies in real time, generating reports, and then you have developers tools that alert developers on issues within their development environment, providing remediation guidance and those kinds of things. So they each have important benefits, but they're strongly focused on a different target audience. So governance solutions, you'll be providing visibility and control, more catering to management, security, DevOps, and legal teams, versus developers tools, which of course are catering to developers. But you really need both sides of this to have a complete solution. And that's where the WhiteSource solution comes in. And so I want to spend a little bit at the end here talking a little bit more detail talking about that. So as you can imagine, we have two components. We have a governance component, which is WhiteSource Core. This is where you get detection, real-time alerts, automated policies, advanced reporting, and that prioritization capability that I talked about in detail earlier. We detect all the open source components every time you do a commit or run your build. And then once we have that inventory of your open source components, we cross-reference the data with your policies to initiate automated workflows, issue alerts in real time, and offer a wide range of reports available for download, all very easily with a single click. We're also able to determine with prioritization, just to reiterate what I mentioned earlier, if the vulnerable portion of an open source component is directly called by that application, so that you can decide whether to prioritize remediating that specific vulnerability. With WhiteSource for developers, this is where we have all those integrations that I mentioned previously. Browser integration with the Chrome extension, IDE integration with support for IntelliJ and Eclipse coming soon, and repository integration with support for GitHub, Bitbucket, and GitLab coming soon. We also have the ability to do remediation, which I talked about in detail as well. So that's where you get that automatic pull request for vulnerable components that I mentioned earlier. So when you put this together into a complete product portfolio, you have WhiteSource developers covering that planning, that coding capability, and then you have WhiteSource Core covering build, deploy, and maintain. And this is where all these integration points, this is what Amy referred to as quality gates earlier. So in all these different places, whether it's advising through the Chrome extension, whether it's detecting things through the integrated development environment, whether it's doing remediation, all of these things occur at various steps along the way throughout your software development lifecycle. So you can see here all of the different integration points through all of that between the two products that we have, the WhiteSource Core component and the WhiteSource for Developers component. And so just kind of to sum things up here, what really sets us apart, what really helped us attain that leadership position in the Forrester Wave, as called out in that report, and as Amy mentioned earlier, prioritization, helping you focus, helping developers focus on what matters with vulnerabilities with respect to which ones to prioritize and deal with first, right? So we want to be able to take that full universe of vulnerabilities that are being detected and figure out which ones are really critical to address. And prioritization can help that in a big way. With remediation, we take the other side of that. Once you've narrowed down the vulnerabilities that you need to address, we can help you fix those things in a more automated way, helping you win that race against hackers whenever a open source vulnerability has been discovered and the fix along with it. We want to help you get that fix into place as soon as is possible. And then with all of the coverage that I mentioned just a little while ago, with the support for over 200 programming languages, all the environments I mentioned, all the groups that we cater to, whether it's manager types, DevOps managers, security managers with a governance type of solution, or developers with our WhiteSource for developers type of solution, all coming together in a complete solution. So that's what I had for a presentation. And thank you all for listening. And I think we're going to open up and see if there's any questions out there.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Amy, also for your presentations. Wonderful, great job. We do have questions from our audience. I'd like to start out with this one, probably directed more to you, Amy. Why do you think organizations are putting SCA earlier in the software development lifecycle?
Yeah, it's super depressing. I think it's timidity. So software composition analysis paired with dynamic application security testing and static application security testing. The other two tools are older, more well-known. Static is actually moving super early in the software delivery lifecycle. And it just appears that because software composition analysis is a little bit newer, that we just have a lot of timidity about where to put it. I'm feeling like if we put it later in the lifecycle, then it's less risky for us, but it really actually does harm to the developers if we don't put it early. So I think it's actually timidity more than anything else, the fact that it's just a newer technology.
Okay, very good. I guess part of our maturing in our software development capabilities. Next question, regarding your prioritization capability, I think this is for you, Jeff. Are you suggesting that we don't fix open source components that contain vulnerabilities just because your algorithm detects that they can't be reached, or what's the approach to use in those situations?
Yeah, so with prioritization, and this is a question that comes up occasionally, people assume that we're saying, don't even bother fixing these ones where you can't reach them. I mean, really, when you think about it, you got to think about how we set up solving that problem. And that is the fact that there's so many vulnerabilities out there that developers aren't able to address them efficiently. And as I mentioned earlier, they're spending hours and hours of time. So if you've got the number of vulnerabilities that you're addressing is so excessive that it's harming your productivity, this is a way to prioritize those that you're addressing, the ones that have the biggest impact first. You might want to ultimately update that component, but it's not as critical if it's what we're calling an ineffective vulnerability. And I will say too, just because something's ineffective now, if there's changes to your code so that you access that same open source component in a different way, once another scan happens, that ineffective vulnerability could become an effective one because now you're going into that component differently. So, it's a matter of helping you prioritize, but of course we recommend that you keep your software open source components up to date as well.
Okay, very good. Amy, I'd like to go back to you. Which phase in SDLC implementing SCA gives the most accurate or more accurate results?
So, unless you are trying to do that prioritization where it's really a static kind of analysis that goes roaming through your code to try to figure out whether you're using that vulnerable part of the component or not, unless you're doing the prioritization, then actually the earlier the better. There's no real difference in terms of the results. It's just whether or not you can prioritize the results. So you could do it on check-in if you're not doing the prioritization. If you're doing the prioritization, then you're probably going to want to do it on, you could probably do it on check-in as well, but you just see the code flow for that particular piece of code, not for your entire code. Jeff, did you have any input on this one?
No, I mean, just the general notion of the earlier, I mean, I would say rather than focusing on accurate results, focusing on as early as possible intervention, so to speak, as you can, which is why, as you mentioned and I mentioned, with integrating throughout the life cycle as early as possible, and then following up on that is, the best way to approach that.
Very good. Appreciate both your thoughts on that. I think this would be great for both of you to comment on this question about how do we create more security-aware developers. I appreciate, Amy, your analysis on the university programs. What do we as organizations that hire folks that do or don't have security skills for creating secure software? What's the things that we can do to help improve that?
Yeah, so some of the things we can do is if your company prefers to hire from specific universities, maybe it's a university that's close, or there's a top 5 that you guys run with for hiring developers, work with those universities directly. And some ways to do that is, first of all, internships, making sure that you've got your software composition analysis in your software delivery lifecycle, and those internships then use those tools. So they are coming in, pre-graduation and actually using software composition just as part of their development, part of their internship. Another way to do that is to actually donate licenses for software composition analysis to those universities that you're hiring from. Another way to do it is to send your security champions and have them perform security coding workshops. It's true for developers, but especially true for students. If you feed them, they will come. So if you, have a brown bag, or even better, you provide their lunch and say, hey, come learn about secure coding practices, teach them yourselves.
Yeah, and I would just add, certainly those things make sense. And just internally, for a software developer organization, a lot of them don't even have security champions yet, or they're very early on in that process. So, instilling that type of culture through either a champion or, creating other kinds of incentives to develop secure code, I think is a way to go. I mean, I think the academic world will probably catch up eventually. Well, I don't know. I couldn't speculate on when that might happen, but probably when some academic institution gets hit with a security vulnerability, I might imagine. But I think there's ways to do that from a culture standpoint within a company through incentives and champions and other means. Certainly as you go in through development. I mean, it's, the thing you want to try to do, and the reason why companies are often wary about this is that developers don't want to sit around worrying about security vulnerabilities. They want to develop code and they want to create applications and they want to do really cool things to change the world and move the business forward and all of that. So, using tools, there's ours, there's of course others in the industry as well, that really integrate in those into development environments more easily and make that whole process less intrusive, hopefully will help integrate security into the culture and development environment as well.
Very good. If I can just throw in my 2 cents too, I think that engaging the universities is also a great idea. One thing I've seen effective also is a great recruiting tool is have your kind of security champion go do a seminar on writing secure code at the university and, kind of get in front of students and contribute that way. And guess what? You'll also help create a pipeline of potential hires. So good thoughts. Appreciate everybody on that. A question for you, Jeff, on the on this examining code that your product does. I think you mentioned that it looks at checksums, or maybe I saw that on the site too. Does that, to looking at code to find variations and changes and understanding what open source is in your code, is that primarily for speed, or are there other benefits of checking checksums versus doing just straight code scanning?
Yeah, part of it's efficiency, part of it's security reasons, where we're not wanting to necessarily scan everybody's code and looking at lines of codes and that sort of thing. So it's a combination of those kinds of things, really. It's helps match up sort of. It's basically it's like a checksum, but it's more of a hash in general that allows us to match potential vulnerabilities with what we have on our database more efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Great, and I'm sure that efficiency helps not slow down anything in the pipeline too, make that super fast. So,
yep.
Some product questions that we've had, Jeff. Does prioritization support .NET projects, or maybe you can say what kind of projects or development environments do you support?
Yeah, so right now we don't support .NET with prioritization. We support Java, but that we have other languages like Python and others coming on our roadmap. So that'll be expanding going forward.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure that's an area you're focusing on too.
Yep.
Someone asked about Teamcity as it's a CI/CD environment to integrate with, and also IDE environments that you work with. Can you talk a little bit about your approach on those two areas?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with Teamcity and what we might be doing there, so we'd have to follow up on that one. With IDEs, I mentioned we have IntelliJ now, we have Eclipse coming soon, we have other things on the roadmap like Visual Studio Code that will be coming after that, and then there'll be others added along the way, prioritized based on demand and market interest and those sorts of things.
Okay, very good. How do you think the other testing tools like SAST and SAST and DAST will move to AutoRemediation in the future? Maybe Amy, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Yeah. It's an easier problem to solve when you're upgrading component versions. It's a different problem to solve when you are trying to fix something like input validation. So I think we're going to move that way slowly but surely. Just knowing how our developers aren't educated on security. And, we've got all these developers who've already been through school, and how do we move them forward in terms of eliminating the security issues in their software. I do think we will see inroads in that space. I think it will be a lot further along, or it will be much further out than we have, of course, the software composition analysis, which is well on its way. I think they'll probably start by looking at more medium rather than critical and serious. So can we get rid of that backlog? Those issues are typically easier to solve with AutoRemediation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Jeff, anything you want to add to that?
No, I don't have anything additional to add on that one.
Okay, great. Next question would be directed to you, Jeff. I think you talked about detecting security vulnerabilities. Do you address open source licensing compliance as well as part of what you do with WhiteSource?
We do actually. So the way we will actually inventory what open source components you have present, and then look at the types of licenses that you're using as well. So, and one of the reasons this is a concern out there is people need to know what kind of open source licenses they're incorporating into their projects to ensure that they're not unintentionally violating those. So yes, we inventory for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. We also had a question, kind of low-hanging fruit for you, Jeff, just around pricing of how WhiteSource works. Do you have a free version? Tell us a little bit about how people can approach using your product.
Yeah, so we are priced by number of contributing developers. Essentially, what you do is you get the core version, WhiteSource core that I mentioned earlier, and then WhiteSource for developers is an add-on to that. The prioritization capability is also an add-on, but you need WhiteSource core to get any of those other things. We do, and it's by number of contributing developers, and you can see the exact pricing numbers on our website for that. We do have a free version as well. It's called WhiteSource Bolt, giving you some basic security vulnerability functionality that's out there. I invite people to get on our website and check that out and download that as well, and you can play with it.
Excellent. Very good. Well, I think that wraps up our questions. We're getting close to the top of our hour. Amy, Jeff, thank you very much for your presentations. And I'd like to thank also our participants from the audience. Your questions were fantastic, and I appreciate the answers from you both. Just a reminder that our webinar is recorded, and the slides and recording will be available on securityboulevard.com. We'll also be sending out an email with links to those as well. So also check out securityboulevard.com for other security-related webinars that may be upcoming. So please join me, everyone, in thanking today our speakers, Amy DeMartine, Vice President, Research Director, serving security and risk professionals at Forrester, and Jeff Crum, Senior Director of Product Marketing at WhiteSource. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us for the webinar today. We know your time is valuable and we appreciate it very much. It's been my pleasure being your host. Have a great day, everyone, and be careful out there.